Loved a waiter, married a millionaire. I let her believe a lie to see if she'd stay. Chapter 1. A Millionaire's Secret Plan. Ethan Blackwood leaned against the floor-to-ceiling window of his Manhattan penthouse, a glass of untouched scotch in his hand. Below him, the city pulsed with life. Yellow cabs honking, neon signs flickering, and 1,000 lives colliding in the chaos of New York City. He was used to this view, the skyline that represented his success. But tonight, the lights only reminded him of everything he lacked. He sighed, setting a glass down on the sleek, black marble counter. The room behind him, spacious and meticulously designed, felt as empty as it had the day he moved in. His phone buzzed on the counter, the screen lighting up with a familiar name, Sophia. Sophia was beautiful, sophisticated, and utterly predictable. Their date last night had ended the way most of Ethan's dates did, with her dropping subtle hints about a trip she wanted to take or a designer bag she'd been eyeing. He couldn't blame her entirely. After all, his wealth was no secret. Forbes had done a feature on him last year, naming him one of the youngest self-made millionaires in the restaurant industry. But the constant spotlight came with a price. He swiped the call away, letting it fade into silence. He already knew how the conversation would go. Sophie would gush about their potential as a couple, carefully avoiding any mention of the word love. Ethan had seen the pattern too many times to count. "Maybe I'm the problem," he muttered, running a hand through his dark hair. But deep down, Ethan knew that wasn't true. His parents had taught him the value of hard work and integrity, raising him in a modest home in upstate New York. His father had been a carpenter, his mother a schoolteacher. They'd scrimped and saved to give Ethan a better life, and he'd vowed to make them proud. He had, just not in the way they'd imagined. At 30, Ethan owned Harvest and Hearth, a chain of high-end farm-to-table restaurants that stretched from coast to coast. He built the empire from a single struggling diner he bought at 24, pouring his heart and soul into turning it into a success. Now he had everything he'd ever dreamed of, except someone to share it with. "Not like this," he murmured, staring at his reflection in the glass. He turned away from the window and grabbed his laptop, sinking onto the plush leather couch. A new idea had been brewing in his mind, one that felt as risky as it did necessary. What if he could strip everything away? No penthouse, no designer suits, no luxury cars, and live like a regular guy? Would he finally find someone who saw him for who he really was? Ethan opened a blank document and began to type. 1. Live on an average salary. 2. Work a normal job, restaurant staff. 3. No revealing the truth until the relationship lasts at least 2 years. He stared at the list, the cursor blinking at the bottom of the page. The plan seemed absurd, but desperation had a way of making even the craziest ideas look reasonable. Chapter 2. The Double Life begins. The bustling sound of plates clattering and orders being called out filled the air as Ethan adjusted the stiff white apron around his waist. He stood at the edge of the restaurant's kitchen, watching the controlled chaos unfold. This wasn't just any restaurant. It was one of his Harvest and Hearth locations, a mid-tier spot nestled in the heart of Brooklyn, far removed from the upscale venues that carried his brand name in wealthier parts of Manhattan. For the first time in years, he wasn't the boss. Ethan glanced at the clock above the kitchen door. His shift was about to start. He grabbed a notepad and pen from the supply shelf, a nervous energy coursing through him. He'd hired hundreds of servers over the years, but now he was stepping into their shoes, literally. "Hey, new guy," called a deep voice from behind him. Ethan turned to see a burly man with a scruffy beard and a name tag that read Tony, the manager. "You the transfer from Queens?" Tony asked, his eyes narrowing as he sized Ethan up. Yeah," Ethan said, forcing a smile. He'd crafted a simple backstory. Ethan Black, 30, from Queens, just another guy trying to make ends meet. "All right, well, don't screw it up. Friday nights are busy as hell, and I don't have time to babysit." "Got it," Ethan replied, nodding. Tony grunted and turned back to the kitchen, barking orders at the line cooks. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He built this restaurant's reputation on impeccable service and warm hospitality, but from this side of the operation, it felt like an entirely different world. The first hour of his shift was a blur. Ethan carried trays of steaming dishes to tables, refilled water glasses, and memorized the specials Tony had rattled off earlier. He tried not to wince every time a customer snapped their fingers or waved him over like he was invisible until they needed something. "Excuse me, sir," a sharp voice called from across the room. Ethan turned to see a woman in a tailored suit sitting at a corner table. Her expression was one of thinly veiled annoyance. "Yes, ma'am," he asked, keeping his tone polite. "My wine is warm. I ordered it chilled." "Of course. Let me fix that for you." He hurried to the bar, exchanging the glass for a fresh one. As he returned, he caught a glimpse of himself in the reflective surface of the restaurant's windows. His crisp white shirt was already wrinkled, his hair slightly out of place. The woman barely glanced at him as he placed the wine on the table. "Finally," she muttered, dismissing him with a wave of her hand. Ethan clenched his jaw but said nothing. This was exactly what he wanted, wasn't it? A chance to see the world through a different lens. By the time his shift ended, Ethan was exhausted. He sat on a bench in the small break room, peeling off the apron and stretching his sore shoulders. "You survived," said a cheerful voice. Ethan looked up to see a young woman standing in the doorway. She wore the restaurant's hostess uniform, her long auburn hair pulled into a ponytail. Her smile was warm, her green eyes bright with amusement. "First day's always rough," she added, stepping inside and leaning against the wall. "Yeah, you could say that," Ethan replied, managing a weak grin. "I'm Natalie," she said, holding out her hand. "Ethan." He shook her hand, noting the firm but friendly grip. "Don't let Tony scare you off," Natalie said, rolling her eyes. "He's grumpy with everyone, not just the new guy." Ethan chuckled. "Good to know." She glanced at the clock. "I've got a double shift tomorrow, so I should probably head out. But welcome to the team." "Thanks," Ethan said, watching as she grabbed her coat and disappeared through the door. As the room fell silent again, Ethan felt a small flicker of hope. Natalie seemed different, genuine, but he wasn't here to get ahead of himself. For now, he had one job: to make it through this experiment without blowing his cover. Chapter 3. The First Sparks. Ethan adjusted his tie in the tiny bathroom of his rented studio apartment. The mirror, cracked at the corner, reflected a far cry from the polished businessman he used to be. His clothes were basic, plain button-up shirts and slacks he picked up at a discount store. The apartment itself was bare, furnished with just enough to get by: a lumpy sofa, a wobbly dining table, and a bed that creaked every time he moved. He'd chosen this life. He had to remind himself of that every day. The money sitting in his bank account could buy him a penthouse 3 times over, but none of that mattered now. He wasn't Ethan Blackwood, millionaire restaurateur. He was Ethan Black, the new guy trying to survive in Brooklyn. Tonight was another busy shift, and as he left his apartment and blended into the crowd on the street, he felt oddly free. No one looked twice at him. No one cared who he was. When he arrived at the restaurant, Natalie was already there, arranging menus at the hostess stand. She looked up and smiled as he approached. "Hey, Ethan," she said brightly. "Hey," he replied, feeling an unexpected warmth in her greeting. She tilted her head, studying him. "Rough night?" "Something like that," he said with a shrug. Natalie chuckled. "Don't worry. It gets easier. The trick is not letting the rude customers get to you. Most of them aren't actually mad at you. They're just taking their bad day out on whoever's closest." Ethan smiled, appreciating her insight. "I'll keep that in mind." "Good," she said, returning to her task. The evening was as chaotic as ever, but Ethan found himself watching Natalie whenever he had a moment. She moved with ease and confidence, greeting customers with a smile that never seemed forced. Unlike many of the staff, who treated the job as just another paycheck, Natalie seemed genuinely invested in making people feel welcome. At one point, Ethan noticed her chatting with a young boy sitting at a table near the window. The boy looked shy, clutching a crayon and a piece of paper. Natalie crouched down to his level, encouraging him to draw something for her. By the time she walked away, the boy was beaming, proudly showing off his doodle to his parents. She's something else, huh? The voice startled Ethan. He turned to see Tony standing beside him, arms crossed as he surveyed the dining room. Natalie, Tony clarified, nodding toward her. Always going above and beyond. She's too good for this place, if you ask me. Why's she still here then? Ethan asked, curious. Tony shrugged. She's got dreams. Art, I think. She moved here from somewhere small, Ohio maybe. Says she's saving up, but life's expensive in this city. She works doubles, picks up extra shifts, never complains. Ethan's curiosity deepened. There was more to Natalie than met the eye. Later that night, as the rush died down, Ethan found Natalie sitting on a stool in the break room, sketching in a small notebook. Hey, he said, leaning against the doorframe. She looked up, smiling. Hey, survived another one, I see. Just barely, he joked, stepping inside. He nodded toward the notebook. What are you working on? Oh, nothing serious, she said, closing it quickly. Can I see? She hesitated, then opened the notebook again and handed it to him. Ethan flipped through the pages, impressed by the intricate sketches, scenes of city life, portraits, abstract designs. These are incredible, he said honestly. Natalie blushed. Thanks. It's just a hobby right now. Someday, I'd love to have my own studio or maybe sell my work at a gallery. But for now, she gestured around the room. This pays the bills. Ethan handed the notebook back to her, feeling a strange mix of admiration and guilt. Here she was, pouring her heart into her art and working tirelessly to make ends meet, while he sat on a fortune. You'll get there, he said, his voice firm. Natalie smiled softly. I hope so. As Ethan walked home that night, her sketches lingered in his mind. For the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of something real. Natalie was different, not just in the way she treated people, but in the way she carried herself, balancing her struggles with unwavering optimism. But Ethan knew better than to get ahead of himself. If this was going to work, he had to stick to his rules. No shortcuts, no revealing the truth. He just hoped that if Natalie was the person he'd been searching for, she would understand when the time came. Chapter 4. Love in the Details. Weeks turned into months, and Ethan found himself drawn to Natalie in ways he hadn't expected. It wasn't just her kindness or her drive. It was the way she made even the smallest moments feel meaningful. Whether they were sharing a laugh in the break room or commiserating over difficult customers, Ethan felt more alive with her than he ever had in his old life. One evening, after their shift ended, Natalie approached him with a playful smile. You hungry? She asked, twirling her keys around her finger. Starving, Ethan admitted. Good. There's this little diner down the block. Best pancakes in the city. You in? Ethan didn't hesitate. Lead the way. The diner was exactly as she described, unassuming but welcoming, with red vinyl booths and the smell of fresh coffee lingering in the air. They slid into a booth near the window, and Natalie immediately waved over the waitress, who seemed to know her by name. As they ate, the conversation flowed effortlessly. Natalie told him stories about her childhood in Ohio, painting vivid pictures of summer fairs, snowy winters, and the quiet charm of small-town life. In turn, Ethan shared his modest upbringing, carefully skirting the truth while focusing on the values his parents had instilled in him. I think that's why I moved here, Natalie said, resting her chin on her hand. To prove to myself that I could make it, that I could build a life doing what I love. You're doing it, Ethan said sincerely. Maybe, she said with a small laugh, but sometimes I feel like I'm just treading water. Ethan wanted to tell her everything in that moment, to let her know she didn't have to struggle alone. But he held back. It wasn't time yet. As their friendship deepened, so did Ethan's feet. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. I know. She gave him a small smile, tears still glistening in her eyes. But I guess I love you anyway. Epilogue. 6 months later, Natalie's art gallery opened to critical acclaim, thanks in part to Ethan's quiet investment and unwavering support. She insisted on doing most of the work herself, determined to succeed on her own terms. As for Ethan, he officially stepped down as CEO of Harvest and Hearth, choosing instead to focus on their new life together. They moved into a modest townhouse in Brooklyn, where Natalie transformed the second floor into her studio. Ethan never regretted his decision to test love the way he had. It had been risky, painful, and at times downright foolish. But as he watched Natalie laugh at a dinner party surrounded by her art and their friends, he knew he found exactly what he was looking for. Someone who loved him for him, and nothing else. The end.